right. Hi, I'm Kate Elliott. This is season 3 of Narrative Worlds, which will never not make me laugh to have seasons like all my favorite TV shows. I couldn't find my little written up thing that said what it is, so I'm winging it. Narrative Worlds is me talking with another publishing professional about kind of a deep dive into whatever our subject of choice is for the week or the month, never mind. There'll be 8 more or 7 more because I have no notes to look at. And I'm really excited to be starting season 3 with Dongwon Song, who is an agent with
Howard Moorheim.
That's what I thought, but I didn't want to and a former editor. And so I specifically, welcome, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
And thank you to all of you who are watching today. And I hope you'll have questions for us later, which you can put in the Q&A. I don't look at the chat because I can't juggle that many things at one time. Anyway, I specifically approached you to talk about revision, partly because I've been writing a bunch of posts on my Patreon about writing craft, and I've just been on kind of a revision roll lately. I think I have like 8 posts about revising. I'm not even sure why I got hung up on this, except revision is crucial to me anyway. So I'm going to start by putting you on the spot because you have like a number of hats, right? You've got your agent hat. Can I send this book in? And your editor hat, you've done the work to get it work. So what is revision?
What is revision?
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, revision, you're right. It's a huge topic, right? And it's a fascinating topic. And for something that is so central to making a book, we don't talk about it that much. I think there's like maybe almost like a kind of embarrassment around talking about it, both from writers and industry professionals. I think industry people, we tend to minimize our role. We're like, oh no, it's all the writer. You guys did all the work. It is your project. And that is absolutely true. But there's also the element of, that is where more voices start coming into the mix, right? In terms of like our perspectives of how the book could be more exactly right for what you're trying to accomplish as a writer. Whether that's from a craft perspective or from a publishing business perspective, how does it fit to the market? How does it fit your goals? All of those things. A thing that I talk about a lot is that you write for yourself, but you edit for the market. So, I think the revision process for me is not just clarifying the original vision, but also starting to make those adjustments that get it out into the world in a way that I think it'll reach as many readers as possible, right? That's sort of where the rubber meets the road, which is why I think it can get fraught and tricky and interesting to talk about. Yeah,
because there's that real balance there. What you said, you said actually something I have written in my notes to possibly bring up at some point, which is that the writer comes with this. They've got this vision in their head of a book they want to create, and I'm always a little leery of like beta readers who say you should put this in because they want to revise the book that they think you should be writing. But at the and that to me is always kind of a red flag. You have to be really cautious with comments like that, because the job of the editor and the job of the writer is to make the book the best it can be to what the vision is. But you also bring in this aspect of not revising to the market, but revising with an understanding of the market.
Exactly. And, I think for me, everything I'm going to say is specific to how I approach things. Every editor, every agent approaches things differently. There's no like one right way. There are some ways that I think are less successful than others. But, for me, editing is always about asking questions, right? I'm going to find a thing that isn't working for me in the book, whether it's a pacing issue, a world building question, whatever it is. And then I'm going to ask you a series of questions about it. My worst case scenario is I say, hey, this is an issue. What if you did X? And then the writer comes back 2 days later and says, I did it. I changed it to X. And I'm like, wait, no. You didn't understand what this conversation was. What I was trying to say is there's an issue around this thing. I want you to go and think about it and come back with something that is a thing that I couldn't imagine because it's not my book, right?
Yeah.
The most exciting thing to me is when I'm like, hey, we need to change this small thing. They're like, yeah, I rewrote a quarter of the book because you said that one thing. You know what I mean? And it's like, that indicates to me that there was something there that unlocked in this big way. And then we got a whole new piece of the puzzle that fit in. And, you know, so I think questions can do that. Recommend, like when you prescriptive advice of do X, Y, and Z doesn't get you there as easily.
You know, I wasn't even going to move to this stage of talking about revision yet, but what you say reminds me of something that happened to me recently when I was working on the second Unconquerable Sun book, Furious Heaven. And I spent 6 months writing and well, you know, I write long, and I'm not proud of that. It's just how it is. I'm not ashamed of it either. It's just how it is. Anyway, I wrote and rewrote what was essentially someone else's novel, and to me was like the first quarter of the book. And I rearranged it, and I knew all the events that happened in the book. I knew what all the character arcs were. But the problem was that the events, and it's filled with incident, they just didn't create a narrative spine. They created this is like hard to explain. It's not that anything wrong with the incidents, and they're all there in the book. So finally, I emailed my editor, Miriam Weinberg, and I said, can I send you this like chunk of 400 pages? And I'm stuck, because I had been like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah.
And she said, sure. And I sent it to her, and she turned it around. And we had a phone call. And I don't remember anything else she said about it, except for one thing. Because I said, it's not hanging on anything. And she says, I'm thinking about this one character, and her relationship with her father, and his relationship to this other situation. And that was it.
Yeah.
And she had put that connection together when I couldn't. But as soon as she said that, everything fell into place. And then I wrote a 300,000 word novel in like 10 months because I knew exactly how it all fit. I
don't know what your experience is here, but I love working with Miriam. I have several projects with her. I think she's one of the best editors in the business in terms of like the revision process. And
which she gets conceptually, right?
Yeah. This is exactly the thing where so many times I've seen her just like cut through the Gordian knot of the book and like hit the right note, the right, aspect of tension in the middle of it, and figure out a way to reconfigure the novel around the piece of that. And so I've seen her do just like wild edits of completely rewriting the tone or the voice or the structure of the novel based on her feedback. And then what comes out the other end is infinitely stronger than what went in. And I have an enormous amount of respect for her ability to just like pluck out that one thing, whether it's like this one character interaction, this one like tone or mood. It's a pretty aggressive mode of editing, right? Because I think she has such expectations for what the book can be. But I love working with somebody who like pushes writers in that way. And I do that in my own ways, but
and I want to get back later to the role of an agent in this as well, and how your editorial experience has worked with that. But I want to actually come back a little bit to this notion of conceptual editing, because one of the things, I think the biggest thing I've learned about revision, and I couldn't do it when I was a new writer. I didn't know how. Writing a first draft was easy. I knew how to do that. But if you asked me to revise it, I would like, what? Now, writing a first draft is like, I would rather like stab myself with 1,000 knives, right? And so like I like drag myself through the first draft so I can get to the end, and then I can revise, because I love revising now. But so I've been thinking a lot about how I revise. What worked for me was revising on levels. Not like, I don't try to do one revision where I'm doing the line edits and the structural edits at the same time. I have to do it and work my way down in levels, because it's only when I clear out the underbrush, as it were, that I can finally get down to the fine details. But this notion of conceptualization, that's where it starts. And one of the things that I finally realized was how much conceptual revision I do in my head before I even start writing.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is dismissed because it's not on paper.
Yeah. So I know I keep jumping around in the process, but I think for me as an agent, that's my favorite part of it is I get to be there. My clients will send me a pitch and they'll like text me 2 sentences at 3 a.m. and be like, I got one recently that was like, what if Bachelor, but someone tried to kill everybody? And I was like, what does that mean? I don't know, and like, but the joy of that process is they come to me with something that's borderline incoherent. I say, this makes no sense. What are you talking about? And just, we go back and forth, iteration after iteration of like, okay, I get this part of it. That's a cool vibe or concept. What about plot? What's your character? What are you trying to accomplish here? Why are you writing this? Why does this matter to you, right? And to make sure that from the jump, we're aligned, both in terms of like my vision for it and their vision for it, and I understand what they're trying to accomplish, but also that like, we're taking the concept and we're breaking that story. We're breaking the concept in that like Hollywood sense of like, yeah, this won't be a sequence of events. It'll be a narrative, right? The thing that you were talking about. I read so many books or so many submissions or manuscripts. I'm like, this is just a bunch of stuff happening, right? Yeah. They're cool things, interesting people, but like, this isn't a novel. This isn't a story. And I think without that process, you sort of don't get to that core concept, that core like narrative thrust of the book. And God, I love that part of it. That is the most exciting part of the process to me, and the most satisfying part. And I think that's the part I get to engage in so much more now than I used to be able to do.
Right, because when you were an editor, you would get a usually finished product.
Yeah.
And then you would have to work with that.
Yeah.
Which is also cool.
Yeah, totally.
But it is different than being at that front end. That front loaded end. And I usually don't let anybody, it was very unusual for me to send that partial to Miriam, because I actually don't like people in there at that point. It bugs me because I'm like, stay out. But it saved me a lot of time because she got it. Yeah. And I don't know if I ever, for all I know, and one of the things I love about working with an editor is sometimes there's things I can do on my own. And sometimes that extra feedback from someone who you trust, and a lot of it is that trust, whether it's with beta readers or an editor, is helps you. It's not, I don't want to say, it's not an echo chamber. It's the conversation. Isn't that what it is with people? It's the conversation about something we both care about.
Exactly. I think the hardest lesson for writers to learn as they go from like writing the first draft to entering into being a career writer is learning who to listen to, or not even who, but learning what advice to listen to, right? Yeah. I see so many writers, and I've seen them at workshop after workshop after workshop, the same people over and over again. And I see the same book and it just gets more and more bland as it goes on, as 18 opinions have all been taken into account from each of these workshops, right? And the thing that you need to know is like, when do you stick to your guns and when do you listen to somebody else, right? Yeah. There are many, many times where I say, hey, I think this needs work, or I don't like this character arc. And the author comes back and like, no, this is really important to me because of X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, cool, great. I just wanted you to think about it. I don't need you to do everything that I ask for or make every change that I consider. A lot of times the stuff that it's funny, I don't write editorial letters anymore. I used to do that a lot and write very long ones, 15, 20 pages. But now I find that it's so much more
single space or double space.
Double. That'd be double space. Hey, listen, Davey once sent someone a 40-page editorial letter, so it could be worse. I learned from difficult people.
Was that me? No, anyway.
No, that wasn't you. I don't think that was you.
Anyway, but now,
days, what I find is it's so much more productive to get on the phone with somebody and be like, hey, this thing, let's talk about this thing. Let's go back and forth about this thing, rather than me trying to like me write an essay that will somehow illuminate it for the writer. It's so much faster and more efficient and gets better results, I think, if we can really work through it together,
Yeah, the one time I have found, And I've gotten many fine editorial letters,
Mhm.
but I also like, especially at these earlier conceptual stages and then the structural stage where you kind of figured out
Yeah.
what your aesthetic is, what your tone is. Yes, it's going to be a mystery, not a comedy, and whatever then you get to that structural stage where you need to move things around. But those really benefit from that back and forth.
Exactly.
With a line edit, that's when, to me,
Yes.
I can
Yes.
get that,
Yes.
and I had that happen with young adult. I did that one young adult trilogy, and
Yeah,
I had
yeah,
this
yeah.
editor who was so detail oriented. She was amazing. I learned so much. That actually, as an aside, I want to say that to me, the mark of a good editor is that I, as the writer, am learning working
Yeah.
from them, because
Yeah.
they have a different branch. They have a wider experience than I do. I can only experience writing my books,
Yeah.
but they've edited many books. So
Yeah.
I value that. Anyway, she
Yeah.
would be like, sometimes she would just line out something and not query it, just like cut a phrase.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, oh, okay. And then sometimes she'd say, I think we could just cut these 3 paragraphs. What do you think? And I would say that 90% of the time,
Yeah.
maybe 95 on the line editing business,
Yeah.
she was right. And then every once in a while, they would be like, yeah, I could cut this, but I want to leave it in.
Yeah.
And there were like 2 cases of that, just my little darlings, right?
Yeah. Sometimes you got to save them, you can't kill every darling, sometimes it's just fight for the ones that are important to you, and, I think one thing that's funny that's coming up as we talk about this is how much like every editor has different strengths and different weaknesses, right? Like I'm a miserable line editor. I'm not good at it. I don't enjoy doing it. It takes me forever. So at some point I just realized like, wait, why am I forcing myself to line edit all these things that, as an agent, there's going to be an editor at the other end of this. I just make sure I'm working with people who are also good at that part of it, right? And so I think recognizing where each of our strengths and weaknesses are, if you need someone who's more developmental, if you know that like you do need a little extra push on the sentence to sentence level, then working with someone who's a great line editor can be, the right publishing relationship. And, there's just so many different modes and skill sets in how people edit, which is why like, as with almost everything in publishing, it's so much about like personality fit between writer and editor, writer and agent and editor, even that like finding your people is such the key to success. But it's like, but there's no like listing for editor skills. You know what I mean? You can't like compare people's stats. It's not like Pokemon, right? So like finding the right person is really hard. Yeah.
But that's a great idea now that the Pokemon editor.
Yeah.
Yeah. But which brings me actually, which makes me think about the thing that the writer can do and really has to learn to do, which is they have to learn how to revise. And it wasn't easy for me to do that, but I did it in pieces. I didn't try to like become a brilliant reviser the first time I tried to revise a book. I just accepted that, as with my books, hopefully I'm getting better at each stage and hopefully I'm learning something at each stage.
Was there a breakthrough moment for you though? Like, was there a moment where you were like, oh wait, I think I'm getting better at this, or, oh, I need to think about this way?
I would say that with each different editor I worked with, I began to see things, because I've been fortunate and worked with good editors, even the problematic one, Jim Frankel, was a good editor, and I learned stuff from him. Right? Is it? So
you can be good at your job and a bad person.
So I think what I focused on was learning what I could from each person and seeing what it gave me. So, and I think as an author, I had to be honest with myself. What am I not good at, or what is my weakness, and what are my flaws? And so I want to shore up the strong point. I always want to emphasize and shine a light on the strength, right, that I have, because that's why people come to me. They don't come to me for my weaknesses, but then my job is to bring those weaknesses up so that they are closer to the strengths. And so for me, like line editing was a big deal. I'm a bit of a I can be a bit of a sloppy prose writer. I definitely, in the Crown of Stars series, if I could use 3 details in describing the village, I would. and now I know how to use that right one.
Right.
It's so, but that was a process that took me a long time. And actually thinking about this business of layers of revision, we've got the conceptual, we're trying to figure out what the book is, what's the core, the soul, or the heart of it is, and how it's going to be produced. And then once you've got that, you've written it, then you've got your structure, and do you need to move things? Are you entering at the right place and leaving? This is how I do it.
Are these arcs working,
Yeah, that's something we should make a note on that. Let's come back to that.
We'll come back to that.
And then I go down to the scene level. Is this scene? I was, as a child, my parents took us kids to see a lot of Shakespeare plays at the Ashland Shakespeare Festival. So a lot of my way of thinking of scene is that Shakespearean theatrical thing. You walk on stage, have an interaction, and then it ends, right? And they walk off stage. So it kind of, not quite that, but you know what I mean. So then, but I can't really make the scenes work until the structure's right. Because I have to know where the scene is, in what place it is, right? And then, but only when that's all cleared out. And I'll be doing like prose editing the whole way, but only when I've got all that done. And this is what I had to learn. Can I do a line edit? Because when I clear everything else out, that's when I can really see the words. And I can't do that at the structural level.
I think that's true of most people. Every now and again, I run into a writer who just like can't move forward unless the sentence is right. You know, and it's always really interesting working with someone who operates that way, where it's just like, nope, this sentence isn't right. We're not getting to the next beat until we figure this one out. You know what I mean? And it can be a slow process, but also sometimes it can produce truly wonderful results. I think one of the things that I try to get across in this and almost every publishing topic I talk about is there's so many ways to do this, and there's no right one and there's no wrong one, right? And but I think for most people, if we're talking like most writers, that sort of like what you're calling conceptual to structural to like that beat level to the sentence level are all, it's just so the way to do it. I think that really helps people approach it, from sort of like a top-down funnel until you're dealing with the individual word choices in a way that I think is easier to do once you know what the story is, once you know the character arcs, once you know the structure is working and flowing,
And once you know what that scene really needs to do.
Totally.
If it was two scenes before, it would have had a slightly different. But I want to emphasize what you just said, that you've got it, that every writer has to figure out what works for them. And I can never emphasize this enough. When someone says there is this one way to do it, and that's the way you do it, that's never
immediately just like break out in hives anytime I hear that. But it's even worse than everyone does it differently. It's worse than that because every book is different. And you can hear that from you talking about different contexts, right? You talking about the YA versus the second book in a series where you're like, no, I needed help at the conceptual stage in a way that you would normally protect that from other people's, influence. Because that's what that book needed, right? You needed to talk that through with somebody in a way that you usually don't. And, so many times when I've seen a writer get stuck, I just help them completely shake it up. I've forced people to throw out their outlining process, right? I've been like, use note cards, don't use note cards, just discovery, right? Just do this, just do that. One of my clients like recently wrote a 200,000 word novel entirely handwritten, just because like we needed to break him out of his habits.
My hand is hurting.
Like, I know. I don't know how he did it, but he loved doing it. And now I think that is his process going forward. But, again, every writer's different. Every project's different,
Yeah, yes, I completely agree. Find your process, and also find your process for the book. I mean, it constantly changes. So I want to, I have many questions. Do you have anywhere you want to go right at this second that your heart is leading you?
I am happy to follow wherever you lead. I'm sorry if I like wander off the track all the time.
No. This is no. Oh, come on. I am the empress of tangents, as you know, as we all know. So let's talk about structural editing.
Totally.
Tell me what it is.
Okay, so
not me. Tell our wonderful people here what it is and how it happens. I mean, I have my opinions, which we'll hear in a minute, but
I kind of touched on this a little bit, but for me, structural editing is reading the whole manuscript and looking at it from the 10,000-foot view, right? Are the beats happening in the right place? Does information feel like it unfolds in understandable and relatable ways to the audience? Do the character arcs make sense? Do we need to move sections around? Do we need to cut the whole section? Do we need to shift the POV? Do we need to add a frame story? All these things are things that I play with when it comes to structural, because there's so many different tools you can use at that point in terms of what is making this story work as a story, right? So if conceptual is what's the heart of this, what's the narrative impulse of this, what's like the thing that ties it all together, sort of thematically, narratively, all that, then structure is what are the mechanics by which we are telling this story? And you have your standard toolkit of POV, character, plotting, world building, I don't know what the exact list is, but those are your basic tools, and you are applying them at a high level, right? You're taking whole chunks of the novel and moving around. You're moving chapters, scenes. You're not moving paragraphs usually. You're moving beats, right? And I think that's a different way to think about it.
Can you briefly define beat?
Can I define beat? So
because people use it. I mean, I know what I think you mean, and I think we probably mean the same.
No,
thing,
I think it's useful for me to explain it, even if it's just to myself in some ways. You were talking about like scene editing, and immediately in my head I was like, oh, I think of that as beat editing, right? Where a beat isn't necessarily a scene in that two characters enter and character leaves, but it's also not a chapter. It is an emotional moment in the story, right? It is some kind of a plot element where characters enter with one emotion and they leave with another emotion, right? Or the reader leaves with one emotion.
I am your father.
Exactly.
That's a beat.
That's a major plot beat. But Star Wars is a great example of so many discrete little beats. Star Wars is really useful because it's a really weird movie when you step back and look at it structurally. It's a whole lot of very disparate, very almost jarringly different tonal beats, but they all work together because the whole overall arc of it is so satisfying. But if you break it down on a mechanical level, each beat feels wildly disconnected from the one that happened before it, which makes it useful to look at and be like, oh yeah, they're on a spaceship now. Oh, they were in a bar a minute ago. Oh, they're in space now. Each of those have these discrete elements, and it's so, Lucas was so clear in his vision of like what he wants each moment to communicate. And I think that's how I think about it. What are you trying to communicate with each of those things, right? If you were a Hollywood writer, you'd usually write each of these things on a note card and lay it out. And then each of those note cards become an element of the script, right? And for a lot of writers, it can be really useful to break it down into note cards in that way. The line between scene and beat is real blurry, but I find the concept of the beat to be slightly looser in a way that makes it useful for me.
It's interesting, because I was just thinking about this recently because I'm working on a first draft, and I was writing a scene and I thought there's too many beats in the scene. I need to split it up.
Yeah.
Either by a chapter, like we paused to drink tea and the door slammed open and chapter start new one, or by taking one of these, because you can't have Luke, I am your father, and throw me another beat that could happen like 5 seconds later. I love you, Leia. Yeah. We're gonna incestuously have children, or whatever, right? You don't want to cram them together. You want to separate. Sometimes you want a small beat and a big beat. Like the big beat brings up the small beat, or the small beat sets up the big beat in one scene. But you don't want. But you've got to always be thinking about how strong is this hitting. What is the tone you want it to create in the reader? And also, is it foreshadowed or set up what came before, which gets into that structural thing? Do I need to move this here so that it can set up this bigger moment there? Or that can tell me something so that when this happens, now I'm getting into that whole thing about involvement, right? Yeah. How are you? Well, you want to be, it's like, you want that big moment, that big emotional moment to be emotional, not because you, the writer, are telling the audience how to feel, but because they have learned enough about the person that they're like, oh, and you don't even have to say it. That's like, to me, that's the great victory as a writer. If I can get people to have that response without me telling them just because of what happened. Exactly. And that's all set up. That's structure and scene.
Yeah. Absolutely. And making that clear and felt like in the body that's good writing, right? I
Yeah.
think when you can get that across so cleanly in that way, I think that's when something is really impactful. I think it's one of the reasons I find myself drawn to like children's media, like I don't know. I think about this a lot of Steven Universe or Gravity Falls or things like that, because like they're so clear about what these big emotional beats are. There's like
Yeah.
so little scaffolding around them that I think structurally I find it so satisfying to look at them and be like, oh, that's how they did that thing, right? And they end up being really good teaching tools as a result.
Yeah.
Pixar movies are like so like simple in so many ways, but they get complexity out of all these simple things interacting. So yeah.
It reminds me of Avatar: Last Airbender.
Yeah.
That one famous episode in season 2, Tales of Ba Sing Se,
Yeah.
which if you hadn't been watching it all up to there,
Yeah.
it would just be this stuff that happens. But because you've been watching it up to there, it's like just these series of impactful moments.
Yeah.
And that's all structure and setup.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, as writers, I have a trick or a tip that Davey was, this was actually even before I was doing Cold Magic with her, but it must have been the previous book. But she said, she recommended this thing called the reverse outline, which I hadn't heard of at the time, where you take the book, this must have been this was Trader's Gate, which was the first draft. So it's the third book of a trilogy. And I had written, the first draft was 350,000 words. I don't know why even. Anyway, and I knew that I had to cut at least 50,000 words of it. And I was like,
at least 50. Yeah.
At least 50.
Just get it down to 300.
Yeah. So, and I was hanging out with her at a convention, and she said, well, do a reverse outline. And I go, what's that? And she said, it's exactly what it is. You do a reverse outline. You start with the last chapter and you list everything back. And then when you have it, you can look at it backwards. So when you look at the first chapter,
interesting,
or the 10th chapter, you can see what you need to get to the next chapter. It works.
I thought I knew all of her tricks, but that's a new one.
Well, get there. You can put the money in my bank later. But
that's an interesting one. I like that so much because it emphasizes the connective tissue, right?
Yes.
It emphasizes how does plot C, how was that set up by B? And if you read C and then you look at B and they feel disconnected, it's like, wait, what?
Yes.
Like, I was just saying, about Star Wars feeling like these really disconnected beats, but they do emotionally lead into each other and world building wise lead each other so well in terms of like, you may escape Tatooine, but the next scene is going to be training about what the Force is, right? In that world building explanation, because emotionally we need that setup to go into the next sequence, as Luke starts to discover his powers, like whatever that happens to be. So like getting that connective tissue in place is just so useful. And that is such a great way to sort of like highlight what the missing links are. Yeah, cool.
And just for people who want to know, what I do is I literally, well, this is not that, but what I do is I put the chapter on the facing page, and then the page here is blank. So I put my notes for revision on this page, so I can have it as I get to the chapter. I can open it and say, okay, I need to cut this, move this to chapter 8, and and whatever. And I did in 1 month, I cut 50,000 words.
Yeah.
And
amazing.
I got it down to 300,000 words, which was as tight as I could manage at that time.
Yeah.
Which is all you can ask for, really.
Also, context for the audience, when we mention someone named Davey, we're talking about Davey Pillay, who is now the president of the Tor Publishing Group, who I worked with back when I was at Orbit as an editor, and was Kate's editor at Orbit as well. So. So now we're in awe. Indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, I've known Davey for my whole publishing career at this point, and we're very good friends. So I can roast her gently, even if she's not here.
You saw the whiskey flask I gave her, didn't you? Yeah, I gave her a whiskey flask that has engraved on it, "Boost of Evil."
Sometimes you just need that little extra hit of to get that sadisticness up, you know?
Yeah.
No, we love her. Anyways.
So we're gonna, if anybody has questions, put them in the question and answer.
We have one.
We have one. Oh, here we go. This is okay. Alice asks, you mentioned editing manuscripts to make them more commercial regarding pacing, world building. Do you ever edit content, like add a romance, change the ending, and so on?
All the time. I suspect this question is being asked in a slightly different way than how I'm going to answer this. You know, but so often I will get a manuscript in and I'll be like, I love this. It's not a YA novel. This is a middle grade novel. Or you know what? This should be an adult novel. Let's adjust the tone or push it that way. Sometimes it is, oh, if you really want this to be YA, there needs to be a romance element. That's just the expectation of the market. So we're going to have to figure out how to either add a romance or push it out of YA into a different category, right? Changing the ending happens all the time. It's usually not like, I don't like, there's certain genres that have very strict expectations in terms of tropes and beats. A lot of YAs like this right now, but romance in particular, you know, you mentioned Happily Ever After and you will immediately get discourse for weeks. But, you know, so there's certain genres that have expectations around what the ending of that is. And if you don't fulfill those, then, you know, you kind of end up in a question of what genre are you in? So, you know, I think there's sometimes when addressing the market, you do need to make some adjustments to make sure that you're hitting those beats or those tropes in the right way. So yeah, I mean, I will suggest changing the ending or writing this from a different POV, depending on what the book needs from a craft level and from a market level, that both of those come into play in ways that are like hard to untangle sometimes.
I want to add to that sometimes it's not, I tend to be leery of writing, of the idea that writing to market works very often. I'm not convinced it works very often if it's done in a deliberate, conscious, even kind of cynical way. But at the same time, when as writers, we work in a commercial marketplace. And as you said, you know, you're not gonna, a book isn't gonna, romance readers aren't going to talk about a book that doesn't have a happy ending, because that's the expectation. So one of the things that happens is if the concept runs up against a kind of a wall of expectation, and at some point that sometimes the writer says, no, I'm going to do it this way, which is fine. But sometimes a writer says, you know what, you know, or an agent says, or an editor says, listen, readers are going to come in and they're going to hit this wall. So you can either say, fine, I'm happy, I'm willing to lose a third of the readers on page 48, or I can think about how I'm going to do it differently.
Well, this is where positioning comes into play. So if an author is insistent on maintaining that, then it's like, okay, let's make sure that as we're marketing this, as we're publishing this, we're making signals that this isn't for the wrong audience, right? A lot of times when I see things blow up online or cause like conflict in some way, it's because somebody didn't signal well what this book is to reach the right readership. It's romance readers picked up a thing expecting it to be romance, but it's actually contemporary literary fiction. Or people wanted a book to be horror, but really it's fantasy. I think a lot about actually the TV adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House. Not to spoil it, but like the last episode of that thing makes a turn that I think is a contemporary fantasy ending, not a horror ending. So tons of horror viewers who had watched it up until that point were suddenly furious about the way that series ended. I think this has calmed down since then, but I just remember at the time there was this huge backlash. I watched it and was like crying my eyes out, feeling like completely overwhelmed with emotion about how much I love this show. And then I went online and I was like, what happened? Everybody hates this? Like, And I think that's what happened. I think there was a genre mismatch at the end where everyone expected it to be a horror story, but it wasn't actually telling a horror story. It was telling a contemporary fantasy family drama story. And it sounds like I'm splitting hairs when I say that, but those kind of things are important. And then how you publish it, market it, and pitch it becomes really important to make sure you're getting to the right audience.
And one of the reasons I did a young adult trilogy was because I wanted to get better at pacing. And I knew that in adult that the expectations and the aesthetic was shifting because and I think in part because of the influence of YA, the big success of YA was shifting into this idea that pacing needed to be a little faster, it needed to be a little less description, and I'm like, endless description. So and I thought, it's going to be, if I do this, they'll force me to focus on pacing, and I worked with 2 editors, and they did. And I learned from that. So I didn't feel like I was doing any violence to the story, because I went in knowing that part of my job with the Court of Fives trilogy was to make it really pacey, and that then I could use things from that later.
Yeah.
And I still do. I still learn lessons that I learned from writing that I still use in my writing now, because aesthetics do change, and it's fine to stay with an older aesthetic. It's totally fine, but you may struggle if your goal, you may have to, again, look for, you might not get that big deal.
It's good to know that, though. It's good to know that what you're doing is for a specific audience and approach it, I love a thing that sometimes feels throwbacky, and you just need to make sure you're signaling that when you publish it. One thing I wanted to flag before we move on, actually, that's
I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Anyway,
that's going back a little bit. Is can I curse on this?
Well, it's fine with me.
Okay, so
there's
a structure for giving editorial feedback that I think of as the shit sandwich. And the important part is you start with the simplistic version is you start with compliments. The middle part is you go into the detailed critique and feedback, that's sort of the negative comments, and then you end with, again, being like, this book was really great, I really love it. Now, everyone gets very dismissive of the complimentary parts because they're like, well, that's just like meaningless fluff. Give me the meat of the sandwich. Give me, the challenging things about how the book is flawed. But for me, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. The bun is incredibly important here, the beginning and the ending, because that is an exercise in alignment. That is the editor or the agent aligning with the author, saying, hey, I think the book you wrote is. I love this because this is a deeply emotional journey, a story about female.
Uh-oh. We are losing Nathan. I have lost Dongwon.
Oh, we're back.
Yeah, okay.
Did I cut out there, or?
Well, you did for me.
Okay.
You're talking about the meat. You were getting to the bun. You were going to talk about how important the bun is.
So the bun is an alignment exercise. It is making sure that I, as the editor, understand your vision, and I'm going to repeat your vision back to you, so that if you read that part of it and you're like, oh, I didn't mean to write a book that said X at all. I was trying to read a book that was Z. And so, I think being able to have that conversation, understanding we're on the same page, we have the same goals. If you're like, I wanted to write a pacey YA thriller, and I come to it and like, what a beautiful, quiet character story. You're like, wait, hang on, that's not what I was trying to do here, right? Then we can have a conversation about what the core of the book is. So, I think people can be very dismissive of that structure, but I think that structure is actually incredibly useful and important, and that all 3 parts of it are really both emotionally important to make sure you're not just like beating up on the writer, but is logistically and textually important too. So, no.
I think that's a super important point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that's, of course, that bun, shall we say, that alignment. That's really usually what people come to the book for, not for the things that are fitting. That's the core, the seed. That's what people fall in love with. Okay, we've got 3 questions, and not a, so Eugenia, do you think novels can become quite different dependent on the editor working on them? Is an editor co-writing the book with the author?
I would not say co-writing. I definitely push back on that. But I do think who edits the book can change the book significantly. I've had projects be rewritten from word one after going to a particular editor, where what came out the other end was very different from what we submitted. And that's true of me as an agent too. Like books get submitted to me and I'm like, I love this. Let's start over. You know what I mean? Like I've had authors rewrite a book sometimes multiple times before we go on submission. And that's a big conversation and a difficult conversation. I think it has led to some really great books, but of course that's really different. If they had gone with a different agent, then they would have had a really different book. There's one project that's out there right now that's been hugely successful from a writer who has an amazing career. And she ended up going with a different agent because I said to her, hey, I think you need to rewrite these components. These elements, I think, should be changed to make it that book. And my vision for what that book is really different than the one that's in the world. Was I right or wrong? I don't know. I still think I'm right. That book sold great, though. You know what I mean? Who knows? There's no right or wrong. She made a choice of who she wanted to work with based on that feedback, based on what that collaboration would look like. And because I am pretty specific, I'm not aggressive in you have to do my vision, but I do think it's important to push writers, important to say, is this really the best version of this that we can conceive of, right? And making sure that it's there. There's no good enough, right? And that can be a difficult perspective to work with sometimes, and not everybody wants to do that or gets the most out of that kind of process. So yeah, I mean, novels are really different depending on who edits them. I think that's 100% true. And it means I am super careful about who I work with, who I submit projects to, who I sell projects to. I don't submit books to people I don't trust. I mean, sometimes I submit books to new people just to be like, what's your vibe? Because the only way to find out is by working with somebody, really. So I like to take risks on new editors, but if I have a bad experience or if I don't like books that somebody publishes, if I see things that I'm like, wow, I really would have edited that differently, then I don't submit to that person, right? And there's no shade necessarily. I mean, there's lots of different ways to do this, like I was saying. So
from my perspective, I'm really stubborn about my vision. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that to at all. That's just me. I think there's a lot of value in. Yes. I think there's a lot of value in the churn. And it's funny because now at this point in my career, I'm like, I wish I had more of that, right? The wrestling at the conceptual stage. Because now I'm wondering, well, maybe I was, maybe it's time for me to let go of more of that conceptual issue. But I will say this about it is that I can see that each of my projects would have been different if they'd been edited by a different person, maybe not substantially, but even in small ways can have unusual, can have unexpected small things can be different in it. I mean, that YA doesn't look, again, I talk about that a lot because it was such a different experience for me.
It reads really different from any of your other books.
It does. And if it had been written as an adult novel, I could have written it as an adult novel. It would have been a completely different, it would have been the same book, but very different.
Yeah.
And so I think so. But I agree that I don't think an editor who's co-writing is doing that's something different going on.
Listen, that has happened.
I know.
We don't talk about, but like, yeah.
Oh, well, there's the whole other issue of someone who's actually literally writing the book with an author because the author isn't really writing the book. But
yeah, I mean, there's a very famous editor whose name I'm blanking on, and they published his editorial notes on a famous manuscript. I can't remember which one it is also, and he's almost basically co-writing that book. Like, he's so aggressive in the things that he's suggesting and insistent on certain language choices that there is a point at which I'm like, who wrote this thing? You know what I mean? Which isn't taking away from the writer's vision. I think it's an older school model of how to approach this. It is certainly not one that I ascribe to in my own personal practice. So
and I don't know that I think very few editors today would even have the time
Okay, yeah, there's also
In-
that part.
unless the publisher had paid so much for the author that they were, that they had to, right?
Even then, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So Erica asks, any strategies? We've got two really, really great questions, and I don't even know if we're going to have time, but we'll pump it. Or I can make you come back next year.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, because I have one extra episode that I haven't filled yet. Any strategies for when rearranging scenes for the sake of structure and emotional arc has created an Escher-esque tangle in terms of causal effects? How do you tackle cutting through to get the story to make logical as well as emotional sense? I'm going to say that's when you use your reverse outline.
Yeah.
Or if that doesn't work for you, like a tree,
yeah.
or a storyboard, or a whiteboard, or your cards, and you just line everything up.
Yes, I think that's all great advice, and I think those are great mechanics to figure that out. I'm also going to say another thing that might be slightly controversial, which
I can't wait.
At some point, who cares? If the emotional logic is there, then if a certain causal thing doesn't quite line up, yes, someone will write a review. Someone will leave a 2-star Goodreads comment that's like, this, bottle appeared in scene 3 when really was introduced in scene 4, right? At some point, that's kind of inevitable. Once you do enough editing, once you have worked on a thing long enough, continuity errors will exist, right? No book is perfect in that way. No story is perfect. So don't over-index on this. Don't get obsessive about, does all this line up? And then also, you will have a copy editor at the end of this process. And God bless copy editors, because they will go through and think about the consistency of this, be like, hey, your character's eye color changed, right? Or, hey, you said this 2 pages ago, now you're saying this. That doesn't line up, right? So there are people in the process whose job it is to make sure those things line up. And when stuff gets by them, yes, somebody will complain, but people will complain about anything, right? So figure out where your line is about how much you care about this and how important it is to the story you're trying to tell. And then you can kind of let it go.
I think that's good advice, because the reality is someone will always find something to dislike in the work. And there will always be mistakes. Like the time, like spelling HORDE, HOARD. So, so the horde and the horde, but, or the time that my dad said to me, this was on one of the Geron books. He says, your oxen are harnessed wrong. And I'm like, oh my God. Yeah,
I think my most annoying editorial note I ever left in a manuscript, so I'm a woodworker as a hobby, and in a manuscript, I just left a note. I was like, I believe you mean an ads, not a plane. And I was like, this is the wrong green woodworking tool for this particular era in history. It was just like, I mean, I was mostly kidding, but
but that's if you can
know
get
stuff
it
that
right,
you don't know, right?
Yeah,
like,
but we can't know everything.
Exactly. Look at YouTube videos about Marvel movies and just realize how deranged people will become about the slightest continuity or the slightest misstatement or technology. It doesn't matter.
Let me come back to one thing though about the logic thing, and this is why I really genuinely do like, if not a reverse outline, a way to say, when you're talking about the beats and the emotional beats, what does this character need to know in order to realize this important point, and what does the reader need to know to care? And just that's what you're needing to line up all the way through. And then it should do that, and you should have a nice smooth movement.
If you connect your world building and plot development to emotional beats, then if you line up your emotional beats, then your narrative beats will also line up, right? There should be connective tissue between what the characters are doing and what they're feeling. And if moving your emotional beats around means that your causal beats aren't lining up, that means that you need to tie those two things together more closely.
Perfect. Yeah. And so because we're actually out of time, and there's a writing date with Dawn Bogle next. And I want to say that, anonymous attendee, you asked this fantastic question. You nearly went into character arcs earlier. Can you elaborate a bit on them? So I'm just gonna say that Dongwon has already agreed to come back next year, either
We
March
can do
or
a whole
May.
episode about
And we'll do a
character
whole
arcs.
episode
Yeah,
on
let's do it.
character arcs. Okay, we're on. November 20th is Ursula Vernon. We're going to talk about both writer and illustrator. We're going to talk about not just nobility, everyday life as a tool for world building. Same time, same third Sunday. And I want to thank you, Dongwon, so much. This was as great as I knew it would be. So my expectations were met.
Thank you. This was a total delight. What a fun topic. And you are such a delightful conversation partner about everything, but this in particular was
I know all
perfect.
the best people. That's why. And I want to thank Nathan.
Because you're one of the best people.
I do. I want to thank Nathan, who's our behind the scenes person. And I want to thank all of you who are here today. And those of you who are watching this on the YouTube channel, thank you also. And we'll be back in November, and Dongwon will be back next year.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.